Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Krista. I so appreciate you and really glad to join you here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk to you today about your book and your work and all the things that you're doing. If you want to just give a quick introduction about who you are and what you do, I don't know that anyone listening or watching this today is not going to know who you are, but just in case.
Oh, thanks, Krista. Well, I'm Dr. Judy, and I am a clinical and forensic neuropsychologist. I'm a tenured faculty at Pepperdine University, and I'm also a published author of Stop Self Sabotage, which was my first trade book. And then this one, The New Rules of Attachment, which just came out. So I'm really, really excited to really share this information because I see that it's so universal and impacting so many people, which is one of the reasons why I wrote this book after Stop Self Sabotage.
Self-Sabotage is a great book as well, so people should definitely pick that one up if they haven't read it already. And this one just came out in March, correct?
Yes, this one just came out like literally 3 weeks ago. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
This is a spiritual-based podcast. We sort of investigate the cross-section of spirituality, personal development, and healing. So you're obviously a great guest to have on here. So I'm always curious about people's early childhood experience with religion or spirituality or nothing at all, and then sort of what they've centered and anchored themselves in as adults. So what was that story like for you?
Well, so I grew up in a very religious and spiritual family, mostly through my maternal grandmothers. So my parents identify as Christian, as Catholic. My dad's side of the family is Protestant Christian, and then my mom's side is Catholic. But they themselves were not necessarily practicing so much of many religious activities or religious like community events, like not really attending those necessarily, but my grandmother was. And she was really my primary attachment figure in my early years because my parents were working 2 to 3 jobs each, trying to make ends meet so that they could feed us. I mean, we were very, very poor. We were totally in poverty for a good amount of my first few years. And so, really, the person I connected the most to, just in terms of time, was my grandmother, and so she had a huge impact on me. She was a very spiritual person, had many spiritual practices, like shared her understanding about God with me. And that was always something that was pervasive throughout my childhood in various ways, but also because my parents, once we moved to America when I was 9, they are more what we call like holiday Christians. Like we obviously go around Easter for services, around Christmas, but like on a day-to-day basis, not so much. But as I was preparing to go to college, I told my mom and my dad that I was really interested in essentially going through first communion before I got to college. And so my dad said, "Oh, actually, one of my best friends from college is a Catholic priest. So let's go to his church and see if we can have some kind of fast track program for you to do this over the summer." So I basically had one-on-one first communion classes with a nun. And then right before I went off to college, I got first communion. It was really hilarious because most of the people in my first communion class were like 4 years old, and it was like me, all in our like white little frilly dresses and whatnot. But it was a lot of fun. So I did that. And then when I went to college, I really just really leaned into my spirituality even more because you're in a new place. Like you're trying to get your understanding of who you are as an individual. You're out on your own by yourself. And I think that's when really my spiritual practices and my closeness with God grew even more, is like through that experience of being independent without my family for the first time, like really developing a closer relationship with God to anchor me.
Yeah, that's really fascinating and really interesting. Your grandma sounds like a really cool character to have in your life at your early experience.
Yeah, she was hilarious. I mean, she would be reading the rosary 2 or 3 times a day. She was super attentive to me,
Oh.
like because I was the firstborn, so it was really just me and her for several years until my sister was born. And then she would cook dinner for everybody, including my parents when they came in between their jobs to eat dinner. And then she'd also host like a little mahjong ring, like in her, like to play mahjong with her friends at night and cook for them. I was like, how did you do all of that? But anyway, she was a
Oh.
very, very I would say accomplished and loving
Yeah, she
person.
sounds great. Awesome. Well, thank you for going into that detail. I really appreciate it. I'm always just really curious how people get, along in this way. And religion and spirituality is changing so fast and so quickly. So it's so interesting and fascinating to me. So your book is about attachment theory and attachment styles, and I think for the most part, everyone that would have come to this podcast will have some understanding of attachment theory and attachment style. So we're not going to do a baseline of that specifically. I did want to start with just at least naming that there's the four: secure, avoidant, secure, and disorganized. In case people can't remember those right off the bat, because we'll be diving into that. But one of the things that I thought I wanted to ask you specifically first was, like, I think in the realm of like personal development and healing, I think a lot of us are interested in unlocking information about ourselves so that we can sort of be better partners, be better siblings, be better, workers and employees and leaders. And I was wondering, with attachment theory, how do you think that helps us reveal our connection, and how does it help us break our old patterning and traits with people? Like, I think it reveals something really interesting for each individual, but for you, is there like a overarching reveal that you feel that you find when you look into this specifically?
Yeah, I think that people oftentimes talk about attachment in terms of their relationship with a romantic partner. That's what we see the most in, just like in pop culture, on social media,
Yeah.
online articles and whatnot. But I think that people are just missing like this huge point, which is that really the most important piece is that attachment goes into your foundational belief of self. Like how you
Hmm.
view yourself, what your self concept is, how stable that self concept is. Is it positive? Is it balanced? What's your self-esteem? Do you believe your quote unquote ideal self, that like best self we're striving for, do you even believe that that's achievable? So much of that has to do with your early attachment style. And then as I was preparing to come on your podcast and talk to you, and knowing kind of your content and what you like to explore with your other guests, I was thinking about how much that also even relates to your relationship with God or a higher
Mm,
power, right? Because if you have insecure attachment, as a result of your upbringing with the primary caregivers in your life, maybe during times of trouble, especially, it can also affect your relationship.
yes. I've said that a ton here on the podcast, that I feel like our relationship with God is in direct correlation to our relationship with our parents, and it mirrors it in that exact same way. So I love that you said that.
Yeah, because God is your parent. It's the ultimate. God is the ultimate parent,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that certain trust or distrust or feelings that you have about leaning on others, that's going to come out in your relationship with God. So for me, I would like to think that generally operate as a securely attached person now in my
Hmm.
life. I think that if I didn't believe that all of us could do that to some degree, I wouldn't have written this book. You know, my parents did the absolute best that they could, but like obviously I still emerged with maybe certain shadows, I would say, of like
Sure.
a insecure attachment style. And I think probably the one that I would identify most with is probably the avoidant
Hmm.
attachment style. So generally when I have difficulties, I don't reach out to people. I kind of just go further into myself, and I kind of avoid talking to people about it. I don't want to be a burden on others. I'm not even sure how I feel about it myself, or I'm just going to solve this problem myself. And I've noticed that that affects, my prayer life. So that when I'm stressed, you know, I I don't I mean, I can pray very well when I think things are going well in my life. But like if I'm under stress, I notice that sometimes I'll like
Right.
disconnect more in my prayer life from God. Like I'm kind of afraid to ask him
Yeah.
for what I really want. And I think that that
Hmm.
that that mirrors kind of some of those shadows of
1,000%.
avoidant attachment, right? Whereas I've talked to people who maybe have a little bit more of an anxious attachment. So then when they're in troubled times, it's like, is God mad at me? Is God okay with this? Like, did I do something to piss him off? Like, why am I not hearing his voice, etc. So it totally makes sense. I mean, to me, I just feel like that
Hmm.
it just goes into so much of your belief system in terms of how much you can even rely on God, who, like, again, you understand this idea
Hmm.
that they're gonna be there for you always. But I think how much you actually realize that on an emotional level rather than like the intellectual level and what you're supposed to say is very different.
Yeah, I deeply resonate with that. I definitely had an avoidant attachment growing up as well. I was in foster care, and then I was got adopted into a family where emotional availability was not, available to me. And so I learned to become hyper independent. And for the longest time, like, I really really loved my hyper independence, but then you realize that it really is a crutch in connection. And also like,
Yeah.
there's these funny moments too. When you were talking right there, like there would be times when I would be talking to like, the divine feminine and being like, sorry to bother you, but it's like, I don't even want to like reach out because I'm like, but it's that same relationship with, with my adoptive parents, I'm
Right.
like, oh, I don't want to bother you guys. But so I love that we talked about that with the self-concept, which is perfectly leading into my next question, because I really wanted to unpack the self-concept because I think it's such an important thing. I wanted to read this quote from your book that I thought was really important for people to sort of really think about, particularly through the three parts of self-concepts, which are self-image, self-worth, and ideal self, like you said. And I think we're vacillating between those, the ideal self, right, and the self-image and self-worth, depending on where we are on
Mhm.
the spectrum, probably through the most of our life. But I'll let you answer that. But the quote is, our minds are naturally inclined to use simplified strategies to conserve mental energy and reduce cognitive load. In many ways, this is adaptive and necessary. For example, when we have to make decisions without time to analyze the nitty gritty, but this cognitive miserliness can lead to biases and errors in our thoughts and actions. This is why our attachment experiences have such a profound impact on us as we grow. The stories we learn from our caregivers become the simplified strategies we use to see the world and ourselves. They become shortcuts to our self-concept that are hard to shake for two reasons. The first is because they're so readily accessible. We are likely to quickly classify ourselves as being less capable, less worthy, or less lovable than others. And just because these thoughts have been with us and percolating with us for some time. And the second has to do with the brain's self-confirmed bias. So I just felt like that was such a huge thing for people to try to wrap their minds around, that it's so unconscious unless we take a look at it, right? Like unless we say and stop and understand, like many of us don't even consider reevaluating our self-concept. So when we think about reevaluating our self-concept and the evolution of it, like what do you have to say to that, in those perspectives?
Yeah, I think that so much of it is that when we're learning about how the world works, it's happening at such a foundational time where you're soaking up all this information. It's like your first imprint of how the world is and what your place is in it. That over time, it just evolves into what you think about yourself so naturally that you don't even really acknowledge it on a conscious level. It's just like, okay, this is how it works, and you don't realize sometimes that your worldview could be so different from somebody else's, right?
Yes.
Because you're kind of just in your own mode. And as a child, of course, like that's your only understanding. Like you're still learning this idea of empathy and what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. And so as a child, you're just like, okay, I guess it's all me, this is a unique experience just to me. And if my parent is mad, I must have caused it. It's so much easier as a child for us to just attribute those things to ourselves. And so over time, it starts to shape and morph into the way that you just deal with the world and cope even as an adult. And even if you haven't had the same exact challenges that you did as a child, as an adult, you just kind of keep revisiting and recycling those old rules
Yeah.
because it's just how you cope when you were younger. It's not like, your brain is just has an easier time confirming if information that it already has and kind of selectively ignoring the things that don't seem to fit the picture unless you consciously say, hey, let's make room for these new ideas. But that takes a lot more effort. That takes you actually manually having to do that and telling your brain, hey, pay attention and find out a way that this will fit into your life now. Otherwise, it's just always running on autopilot. And it kind of needs to, because your brain is basically preparing itself for like some major thing that you have to respond to with all of your energy and doesn't want you to overuse something. And then when it's really, kind of like a fight or flight time, that you're not able to be able to prepare for that.
Yeah, and a lot of times, like trying to rewire that neural pathway with a new thought, it feels like sometimes so heavy to do because the thoughts that we have are just so deeply ingrained, like you said. And I think it's interesting too when we think about like what happens to us as a child and then how we heal as an adult. Like sometimes it's even just as basic as just revisiting that child and letting them know like that story is not true anymore, right? Like
Mhm.
that's not us, or that's somebody else's idea of who we are. I think for me, definitely that was something that I really had to work on as an adult because I grew up in a family where there was a lot of codependency. And so like there was that extension, and I know you talk a lot about this in the book as well, like there's that extension of like the parent or the siblings that, you're not supposed to be different from them, so your self concept gets really screwed up.
Mm.
And then when you take away all of those things and you sort of evaluate it without those external information or data sets, you find who you really are at the end of it.
Right, absolutely. And I think that again, as a child, you only had the strategies you had access to as a child in a child's eyes. And so it's like as an adult, you're obviously much more capable, but we still don't expand those coping strategies because of that very uh crucial learning period that kind of makes us think that this is how the world works always.
Yeah, I think something that you tie into the book that was really beautiful and really interesting to me was the idea of like well, first of all, understanding your attachment style, then adding another layer, which is like looking at your self concept and over those three pillars, and then saying to yourself, like, can I create a new vision for my life after I've reevaluated what my ideal self might look like and how I'm going to get there and how I'm going to be different in relationships. One thing I thought was interesting was how if we have this unconscious behavior of holding ourselves back and not believing
I
we're
think that we do
worthy.
that
Why do
because
we do that
there's a
when
part of
we're
us
when
that's
we're in
afraid to dream
that
bigger,
that
especially when you've been
space?
disappointed in the past. And if you've gotten any kind of messages that makes you think that you're not worthy of better outcomes because of certain negative things that have happened to you, especially in our early years when that was so foundational to helping to form who you think you are. So I think that for all of those different reasons, and it's almost out of self protection that we just say, hey, you know what? If we don't dream bigger, if we just don't even think that that's possible for us, then we're not going to be disappointed again. But then you really then limit yourself for this one life that we all have. I mean, we have like one chance to make the impact that we can, and to hopefully have the kind of connection um, in our lives that really create meaningfulness and joy at a deeper level rather than just that kind of superficial, okay, well, this made me feel good for 5 minutes or for an hour. Like what is it really going to bring you purpose in your life? But it's so hard to even strive for this ideal self when there's a part of you that just doesn't think that you deserve it. And so sometimes this idea of holding yourself back and self-sabotaging is just a way of trying to prevent yourself from disappointment, but obviously then it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like then you are disappointed and then you use that information to say, yeah, see, I knew it. I knew I shouldn't even have thought that I could do this, or I knew that I didn't deserve it anyway, and now this is coming back to bite me.
Hmm. Man, those self-fulfilling prophecies are really sabotagey. I mean, they will get you every time.
Yeah, exactly.
And without giving too much away in your book, because you do offer like a ton of like resources in the actual book and exercises for somebody to walk themselves through this whole process of unlearning and undoing this and really taking a bird's eye view and then like a more a micro view. But in your mind's eye, without saying too much about the book, what do you think is the antidote to making somebody feel worthy if they don't feel worthy?
Yeah, well, I think it's all about reparenting your inner child and essentially using your adult self, who is much more capable, who has much more resilience, who has much more skills and strategies, as a model for that secure attachment to your inner child who didn't get that support, who has some unmet needs, who has some wounds. And until you're able to, you know, establish a more secure attachment with yourself, it's not going to radiate out to the rest of your life. It's not going to radiate out to your other relationships or your goals or what you think you deserve in life. And I think so much of this goes back to, this idea that a lot of people will say, I don't know if I can heal my attachment because my parents or my primary caregivers, whoever was partially responsible for developing these attachment wounds, they're not available to do the work. They don't want to do the work. They're deceased. So that's it for me. And I don't want people to think that they need to rely on anyone else if they want to start that work. They can do it on their own.
Hmm.
And reparenting is not a new idea. It's a therapeutic technique, a group of therapeutic techniques that have been in existence for quite some time. But I think that it's been misunderstood. And I also think that it's been underutilized. And so my goal in the book is to try to make reparenting as concrete and as practical as possible. Like it's not this woo woo idea, it's evidence based. How do we make this
Yes.
more translatable to people so that they can feel like, oh, I can roll up my sleeves and do it myself?
Yeah, no, I love that as well because I think the idea of reparenting yourself and even just going on the healing journey, I think there is this disempowered approach when we start to do that, that we feel like we can only heal to an extent to which the people who have injured us, or that we've injured ourselves in moments. Can we reach ourselves, or can we reach those people? But there is such like wisdom in knowing that, and trusting yourself in the process to say, like, I can heal this even if I don't have to have those conversations with the people, or go back to the situation, or maybe they're not available. There's so much empowerment that can be taken from there, like you said, and relying on our adult tools and our capabilities and our intelligence and our inner guidance to really suss those things out. So I love that you said that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that it is so important that you start to essentially look to yourself for some of those answers, because I think that for the different forms of attachments, you have different ways to try to solve the problem. The anxiously attached person tends to look outwards at other people's validation to solve the problem. People with avoidant attachment looks to achievements and like goals and markers to solve their problems. And then the disorganized attached tends to look for, just whatever form of stability they can find, but oftentimes it actually creates more chaos. And so
Right.
they're not looking for the truest form of secure attachment that already is part of who they are. Like the inner parent, the responsible and caring inner parent resides in all of us. We all have the capability to do that. It's just about inviting that part of ourselves out and saying, okay, like, how do we roll up our sleeves and do this for ourselves? Um, and knowing that once you're able to do that, then it's going to affect positive change in these other areas of your life.
It's so wonderful. I love that you said that. I wanted to ask, so you do go into the book with each of the attachment styles, and then you also talk about sort of healing each one of them. I don't know if you want to maybe just pick one, or briefly go all over three. I was wondering if like we could talk about healing the different attachment styles and breaking those the cycles and the dysfunction from our lineage. I don't know, wherever you want to take this.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as I mentioned, the attachment styles are so foundational to the way we think, the way that we think and our self-talk. And I think that every single attachment style has its prototypical self-talk, and it's really important to recognize that. So for the anxiously attached, their self-talk statements typically sounds like one or more of these four statements. I'm not as worthy as others. I need to rescue everyone. I fear being on my own, and I have to analyze everything.
Mm,
And then the avoidantly attached tends to have these statements: I'm only as good as my last achievement. I must be in control at all times. I keep others at arm's length. And then when the going gets tough, I go it alone. And then people with disorganized attachment tends to think, I deserve to suffer. I hate you. Don't leave me. I can't control my emotions. And my life is in constant chaos. And so for most people who have these different insecure attachment styles, they'll find that at least one of those statements resonates with them. If you have a combined style, some people will say, well, I'm partially disorganized and also partially anxious. Like that's also more common than I think we believe.
correct.
We don't all just fit neatly into a box, and you may have developed, a mixed attachment style because of your relationships with different primary caregivers in your life. And so, in general, I think if any of what I just said resonated with you and you've seen the negative impact of these statements, then it's important to know that there are ways to transform your negative self talk. And so much of it goes back to these more practical forms of reparenting. And so in my book, of course, I go into more specific strategies for each of the attachment styles. But I think that the general theme of reparenting is what's really universal across all of the different attachment styles. And
Hmm.
sometimes people say, well, like, what does it really mean to show up like and be this like inner parent for your inner child? It can be really practical. Each time you set boundaries to protect your well being, that's a form of reparenting. Each time you acknowledge your accomplishments and celebrate your progress, that's reparenting. Each time you listen to your inner child without judgment and you validate that they're feeling whatever they're feeling, that's reparenting.
Hmm.
Each time you try to cultivate supportive connections and recognize what healthy relationships are, that's a form of reparenting. Each time you practice self compassion and forgive your mistakes and release expectations of perfection, that's reparenting. And each time you make choices that align with your most important values, that's a form of reparenting. Each time you affirm to yourself that you are worthy of love,
Hmm.
that's reparenting. And each time you believe in your unconditional worth, no matter what, that's also reparenting. And so in my book, I go through these different strategies of like, how do we do this with ourselves? And certain styles may need certain of these more than others, right? So, like,
Mhm.
boundaries to protect your well-being. Well, somebody with avoidantly attached style, they may think that these are healthy boundaries, but they may be a little too strict, so maybe they need to loosen those boundaries more. But I think that setting healthy boundaries may look differently for each of the attachment styles. Like, the anxious attachment person might say, well, these are the healthy boundaries, but actually it's a little bit more codependent.
Mhm.
So it's like, how do you back up and try to protect some of your own space, right? And then generally the avoidantly attached person acknowledges their accomplishments to a degree, but somebody who has anxious attachment, they may not acknowledge that as well. Listening to your inner child and validating their emotions, this is especially important for people who have disorganized attachment and also people who have avoidant attachment. So I think that for each of the different types of reparenting strategies that I mentioned, for each of the specific styles, there may be like a different way to fine tune that, or there may be a different priority list for each of the attachment styles, depending on what kind of negative self talk is really holding them back.
Dr. Judy, thank you so much for going into that level of detail. That was, you really gave so much in there. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. I think that's going to help people so much. And I think the tenderness of reparenting ourselves with a compassionate and non-critical lens is everything. I think the first time anyone feels like the luxury and the sweetness of reparenting themselves, it heals us so deeply to like literally to our core. So I love that you kept coming back to that idea. I did want to ask in terms of the different attachment styles, like obviously we're interpersonal, we're interconnected, we're dealing with people in various different ways. I wondered if you had any clues or strategies or tips for how do we relate to each other's different styles, without triggering each other, taking that compassionate and patient view with others. What can you say about people? Because we all don't have the same one, like you said, and we're all potentially mixtures of them, and then we're with people who are mixtures of them. So how do we help everybody relate to each other better, knowing this information?
Well, I think we all have our own triggers, probably, if you have shades of insecure attachment style that are still showing up in your life. And it's important to understand that other people are probably being triggered as well. And so, knowing that a lot of the times it's not actually about you, it's also about their own struggles, and just having some compassion for maybe what they're going through. And I think that the most important tool is active listening. Like,
That's huge.
listening for understanding as opposed to listening to respond, which is what we mostly do. It's like we've all done it, right? Like, even when we're trying to be these like engaging individuals at a party or whatever, like someone's talking and you're already thinking about what you're going to say next to be
Or
funny or to be
clever.
interesting, or to like, yeah, or to like keep the conversation going. But like, if you just listened with intention, like, the next thing is going to come to you naturally. And so it's that kind of mindful attunement to other people and their messages, and like trying to hear what they're really saying as opposed to what you think they're saying, or like how you think you should respond to keep your own sanity or to keep your own respect or whatever it is that you think you're keeping. I have this like really recent example of when I just gave a TEDx talk where, I mean, it was a 16 to 17-minute talk that I had to memorize from top to bottom. There were no cues. And I actually did not realize that when I was chosen for this TED talk. I was like, oh, I thought that they had teleprompters. They're like, nope,
I thought they did too.
nope, everybody has to memorize their talk. So that was very stressful. But I realized that I kept, as I was rehearsing, even like the night before and even the morning of, like, as I was rehearsing it, I kept forgetting certain pieces. Like, I would just freeze and I'm like, oh my gosh, this would be so terrible to freeze in front of 1,500 people. Um, but I would freeze when I try to get ahead of myself. Like, if
Mm,
I'm saying something and I was already in my mind thinking, okay, what's my next connector? Or like, what's my next point? And that's when I would freeze. And so I had this like realization of something that I already knew, which is how important mindfulness was. But like, it was a very big realization literally 15 minutes before I went on, which is like, if you just trust yourself and you just stay present to what you're saying, the next thought is going to come.
right.
And it did. So, like, thank God when I actually took the stage, I just tried to like stay with that idea And I did not forget anything major. But any moment where I felt like I was starting to get out of that mindfulness, I would like start to forget. And I was like, okay, you know what? Just get back to what you were just like, just think about what you're saying. So I think that applies to all
Mhm.
of our conversations. It's like if you just don't fast forward or, stay present with it, that's where you're going to have the most important and the most crucial understanding of another person that'll help you to relate to them no matter where they are in their attachment style. It's like most of us are works in progress. So to try to wait until you're securely attached fully and to wait for somebody who you want to partner with to be there, that's not likely to happen. So it's more about
Yes.
accepting the person where they are and being able to support their journey as well as your own. And I think so much of that just starts with trying to have that empathic understanding through active listening.
Gosh, yeah, that's so important. And I think with active listening and present moment awareness, I feel like it also allows people to be deeply seen. And the feeling of being deeply seen, it is so rare in our very busy society that it's so appreciated. I think when you're
Yeah.
in conversation with people and they really know that you're seeing them and you're listening to them, and that you're making all of the connections and observations and sort of everything that isn't said, and reading in between the lines. I think that's such a beautiful way to be with each other. I wanted to ask you too, as we're layering on these different ideas and concepts from your book, there's also the idea of embracing unconditional self-love and compassionate, and basically creating meaning in our life to cultivate joy. Like that, I think that's the ultimate runway for this work, right? So where we start with that? What do we have to say about that specifically to the people today?
Yeah, I think that it's important to get in touch with your values because we're so focused on goals as a society that maybe it's been a while since you've actually thought about your actual value system. What is it
Yes.
most important? What are the most important factors that are important to your life? How do you want to be talked about when you're not in the room? How do you want to be remembered when you're no longer physically on this earth? I mean, all of those things um are really ultimately what's going to bring you the most meaningfulness in your life. And so, being able to do values based work, first understanding what those top values are, and then finding ways to stay in touch with those top values throughout your day. Like, did I do something in the last 24 hours to honor my top values, even if it's in some small way, if I was busy? Um, do you have some way to make decisions based on your top values, because then you wouldn't have buyer's remorse so much, really learning how to infuse that in the different parts of your life, and knowing that if you're guided by your values, then you're going to feel better about yourself, even if it was a day where you made mistakes, had conflict with somebody else, or didn't achieve as much as you wanted to.
Well, and I think with the value system, evaluating that as an adult is really interesting because a lot of us grow up in systems that give us a value system. And then unless we actually investigate it and understand who we are as a person and what we need, we can't really modify that value system. So it's like, I love that you said that because I think that's such an important thing to also maybe take stock of what value systems and things that you value in your life and what you want to give your energy to. One other thing that I really love that you pointed out was like reducing burnout through overcompensation and not asking for help. Like this has been huge for me, and I know for a lot of other people, a lot of we are getting burnt out. What specifically can we talk about in terms of our attachment styles and how we relate to one another and how we're interconnected, where we can help reduce that burnout in our careers, in our family systems, in our relationships, and even in our friendships?
Yeah, I think that so much of burnout happens because we're not necessarily aware of the signs, because we think, well, we care about our work, we like our work. So how could we be burnt out? It's like the people who are burnt out the most are people who probably love their work because they're the ones who tend to overextend at their jobs. So, it's kind of like, yeah, that doesn't preclude you from experiencing burnout. I love my job and I still have to be, okay, you know what? I think I'm getting burnt out right now. Like, what can I do to reset? Right.
And you have a lot of jobs.
Yeah, I have so many jobs. It's like that's part of the burnout, It's just like there's not enough hours in the day. And so, the three main signs of burnout to watch for, and some people might express all three, or some may just maybe just one, is emotional exhaustion, um, depersonalization, which is kind of like distancing yourself or becoming more cynical about your job,
Mm.
and then a reduced sense of efficacy. Like, no matter how hard I work, I just feel like I'm not doing well. And even if people are saying, no, you're doing great, it's like, but I don't feel like I'm doing well. I don't feel like I'm making a difference. So those are the signs of burnout. And if you can recognize which ones that you're most prone to, then you can try to switch course as quickly as possible. And of course, burnout management involves two things. One is kind of like crisis moments where you're like, okay, I'm in a crisis for burnout. What can I do this weekend to reset? Like, I have to do something right now. But then there's also just prevention and like long term management. Like,
Right.
how do we try to prevent burnout from getting the best of us for the most part? And so some of it is like learning to say no, which is the most difficult.
That's huge.
One, insecure attachment in some ways because they're like people pleasers, don't want to say no. Or you don't want to say no because everything sounds like a great opportunity. And for the avoidantly attached person, it's like, I want to grab all my opportunities, right?
Yes.
Knowing what your self-care plan is going to be, and that should be a daily process. People
Hmm.
are like, I'm too busy to do self-care. Well, people who have disorganized attachment don't think that self-care is going to be helpful because they feel so dysregulated. They're like, how is this going to help? But self-care obviously helps with regulation. It's just that they haven't allowed themselves to lean on that or even know what it looks like. Anxiously attached people likely don't think they deserve self-care. Like,
Yeah.
no, 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 like, I have so many problems in my life. Like, my wife is having this issue, my friend's having this issue. Like, I got to help all of them. I don't have time for self-care for myself. And then the avoidantly attached person doesn't think that they deserve self-care on a different level. It's like, well, I haven't achieved enough to have self-care. Like, until I reach my goals, that's when I can rest. Like, I'll rest when I die, like, things like that. It's like, well, no, because we only have the time we have and none of us know how long we have. So you have to do self care every single day in an intentional way. And I break down self care into like six different categories. And I think an easy way to do it is just to cycle through the six different categories. And there's emotional self care, physical self care, intellectual self care, practical self care, social self care, and spiritual self care. And if you can be like, Monday is my social self care day, Tuesday is my spiritual self care day. And then on Sunday, you can just repeat one of the ones that you think you're most interested in or was the most effective. And every single day, you might not have 2 hours for self care, but even if it's 5 minutes, as long as it's planned and it's intentional, it makes a difference. And also, it's you recognizing that you did that for yourself.
Hmm.
So much of that helps to reduce burnout. One thing that I've picked up more recently again is the ukulele. I love playing instruments in general. I love to sing. Like, being a musician has been a big part of my life. But when I got busy, I just stopped playing music.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't have time, I don't have time to sit at the piano. I don't have time to write music. But I recently reconnected with the ukulele because you can't really make too many excuses about it. It's such a small instrument. It fits on your desk. You can pick it up for 2 minutes. You don't have time to play a whole song, play it for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's really helped me because it's really important to just connect with those things that are important to you personally, but also that brings you joy. It's like,
Hmm.
I know when I play music and when I sing, it brings me joy. So why not do it more?
Hmm. And what about the distraction element? Because like we're in such a busy world as it is, right? Like
Yeah.
in our culture right now, like working nonstop, no matter what your attachment style is the thing. Like people are working all the time. They're dragging their kids everywhere. They've got 100 things on their list. But then there's also like the distraction of social media and like a ton of things. We didn't even get to talk about the nervous system, but you mentioned it a few times back there. Like a lot of this is also affecting how our nervous system is being able to relax. And like you do bring data and science into the idea of these stressors are causing a lot of unnecessary effects to our body and things like that. But distraction itself, where do you feel like that fits in the burnout as well?
Yeah, I think that distraction is kind of those things. It's like a double-edged sword. Sometimes distraction is helpful to kind of move through the moment and do what you have
Yes.
to do, but then other times it becomes pathological because you're just avoiding everything and not solving any problems. And so until you're able to really be honest with yourself, it's really all about a balance, right? Like, am I overusing distraction?
Right.
Like, or is it really helpful in the moment? And I think you have to realize that there's a part of your mind that's like wise and understands like truly what's going on and what your intentions are, and just being able to make space to acknowledge that without judgment and saying, okay, you know what, I'm probably overusing my avoidance
Hmm.
today and my distraction today. That doesn't mean throw out the baby with the bathwater. Like, there is time for distraction. That's an important coping strategy, but it's just you don't want to use it so excessively that you actually end up creating more problems in your life.
Yeah. Well, awesome. This hour has flown by and I'm really mindful of the time here. So I want to give you space here to tell everybody like how they can connect with you. If you have upcoming speaking engagements, anything you have going on in the next couple months. This episode is going to air in about 2 weeks. So when people hear this, it'll be about early May time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Thanks for all your insightful questions and sharing about your own experiences as well. You guys can find me at Dr. Judy Ho across all social platforms. Instagram's my primary one. I also give away tons of free resources on my newsletter and at my website at drjudyho.com.
Awesome. Wonderful. And then I always like to wrap up with some gratitude and check in with my guests about like what's sort of rolling around in their heart chakra this week, this year, 3 things they're grateful for before we wrap up.
Well, three things. One, grateful for my family. Two, grateful for my health. And three, grateful for the launch of my book.
Well, I had such a great time with you. It was an honor to have you here, Dr. Judy. I really appreciated you taking all of my questions one by one and just like giving such robust, detailed answers that I know is going to help everybody along this journey. The attachment style, I think, it's like what everyone's very excited to talk about right now. But if we can lend a lot more information and science and data to back up like what's actually happening to us with these things, I think that's really helpful. And then taking that compassionate and loving approach to ourselves as we evolve. In your book is what you talk about. So I really love that you put that in there too. And thank you so much for coming here today.
Oh, thank you, Krista. Really enjoyed this hour with you.
This podcast was written, directed, and produced by me, your host, Krista Ziomara, in alignment with Light Casting. Music curated and created by Mr. Pixie. You can find I'm Awake Now What on all social media channels by searching IANW Podcast. Head over to your favorite podcast app and subscribe, download, rate, and review. Come back every Sunday to partake in a new and enlightening conversation. May you be filled with love and light until we meet again.